Are you searching for a deeper understanding of your faith?
Inspiring Philosophy is your go-to resource for exploring the rich tapestry of Christian thought.
From biblical archaeology to philosophy of mind, we dive into the topics that matter.
Our content bridges faith and understanding, offering insights into God's existence and the reliability of the New Testament.
Join a community where faith meets reason and discover the answers you've been seeking.
Inspiring Philosophy, where faith meets understanding. All right, let's get into it, folks. We're excited to be here. I have somebody with me I've been a fan of for years, going back to like 2008, 2007. I have Dr. Dan Wallace, probably about the time I was first introduced to you, and I finally got you on the channel. It's absolutely incredible to have you here today. How you doing today?
Well, thanks. That's a little bit too much flattery. I'm not sure I was coherent in 2008, but I'm delighted to be here. I really appreciate this, Michael. This is going to be fun.
It is. Yeah, absolutely. I was trying to think, the best way to sort of like introduce you and how to actually get you on here. I thought the best way to welcome you to the channel would be something like this. Nice big chant of Wallace. I thought would be the perfect way to introduce you.
Yeah, well, I'm actually related to him.
Perfect. It's perfect. Yeah. So it's excellent. So the blood of William Wallace flows through your veins, which makes it even more exciting. So excellent. This is going to be a wonderful time. So today we're going to be reviewing a video that Dan McClellan put out a couple months ago. We were talking to a mutual friend. He recommended I have you on to talk about some of the, actually it was his whole idea. He sent me the video and he's like, you should have Dr. Dan Wallace on to respond. And I was like, well, it'd be great, but I don't have his email or anything. And he's like, I got you covered. And so, so he connected us, and it's been great to finally get you on. I know you're really busy, so we appreciate having you here today.
Well, I appreciate it too. This, excellent. I'm looking forward to the looking at this video. I've looked at it once. But I think I have a good gist of where he's going with it.
Yeah, for sure. So we're gonna be responding to a video that McClellan put out, and now we're not gonna say McClellan is wrong on everything. He's responding to a Christian apologist, Cliff Knechtel. Cliff does get some things wrong, and Dan McClellan is right to call him out. Yep. But he leaves out a lot of other information. He kind of like pushes things in directions that's not entirely accurate, and so Dan Wallace is going to provide some additional context here to really answer some of McClellan's claims, to sort of add a little more context to things. And so, yeah, that's what we're going to do. We're going to go through this video. Dan Wallace is an expert in textual criticism. They've been doing this for years. Absolutely. I remember, listening to you back in 2007, 2008, and was blown away by some of your research. So this is your wheelhouse. This is where you roll, is in textual criticism. So
I've been working on it since 1979.
Incredible. So yeah, perfect. So without further ado, let's get into the video, because I know you got limited time, and we will get to some super chats in a little bit. So just start putting them in now, and then in a little bit we'll go through some of those. So this is the video here. Let's dive right in and let's see what he has to say, and then I will stop at the time markers I sent you, and then I'll let you respond.
Languages. Let's take a look at a video.
Can you explain how we as Christians can defend against the argument that the Bible may have been changed over the course of history to perpetuate like an agenda by the church.
Sure. All right, let's see it.
The Greek New Testament that we have today in English is based on over 5,800 Greek manuscripts or pieces of manuscript dated from the 2nd to the 10th century AD, all agreeing to an infinitesimal degree.
So this claim is both profoundly misleading and also just factually incorrect. It's not true. Here is a graph that was created by Peter Gurry, a very well-known New Testament textual critic. And this was published on the blog that is run by several well-known New Testament textual critics called Evangelical Textual Criticism. As you can see from this graph, the overwhelming majority of those 5,700, 5,800 manuscripts come from after the 10th century. Fewer than 10% of that number come from before the 10th century. In the 2nd century, we only have 4 total manuscripts, and at least one of them only consists of 35 words or so. It's not until the middle of the 4th century that we can first cobble together a full New Testament from the available manuscripts. And that's because of the great uncial manuscripts like Sinaiticus, like Vaticanus. So the notion that we just have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to manuscript witnesses to these verses at early dates that agree to an infinitesimal degree is just factually wrong. Also,
So let's stop there for a minute there. So now he used the phrase embarrassment of riches, and that immediately caught my attention the first time I heard it, because that's a phrase you've used. And he says we don't really have an embarrassment of riches that is early. Is that true? What do you mean by that? Can you add some context here to help us out?
Yeah. By the way, Peter Gurry was one of my students, one of my interns. He worked for the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts that I am the executive director for 5 years, and now he's a professor at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. He was at Phoenix Seminary before that. He got his doctorate in textual criticism at Cambridge University. So he's a good guy to quote. We both would agree with Peter Gurry is saying. I think it's true that this apologist Cliff that McClellan interacts with has a number of facts wrong, and it's right that he's calling him out on these.
Yeah.
But in his own assessment, McClellan makes a number of errors too. Now, I want to start by pointing out that I got the idea of embarrassment of riches. It's not from actually what I said originally. It came from Bruce Metzger. And even in one of my debates with Bart Ehrman, we've debated 3 times, he said, now Wallace says there's an embarrassment of riches. And in the 4th edition of Metzger's Text of the New Testament that came out in 2005, he and Bart Ehrman co-authored it. And so I got it from the statement on page 51 of this text. Originally, Metzger's book came out in 1964, where he says, the textual critic of the New Testament is embarrassed by the wealth of material. So that's something that Metzger and Ehrman signed off on. Here's my statement, and I'm going to give you an official statement that I have never mentioned in public yet, the exact wording, because this is coming out in my introduction to New Testament textual criticism that Zondervan is going to be publishing in the not too distant future. Here's what it says. With over 5,700 Greek manuscripts, about 15,000 to 20,000 versional manuscripts, that is ancient translations, and well over 1 million quotations of the New Testament in the writings of the church fathers, New Testament textual scholars face an embarrassment of riches. Now, you asked the question about what about the early evidence? And so let's break this down to the evidence from the first millennium to begin with. And McClellan says that only 10% of all the Greek manuscripts are from the first millennium. His percentages are off. By my count, we have at least 967 manuscripts in Greek alone by the first millennium, by the end of AD 1000. Now, 960 divided by the official number today, which is 5,700 Greek New Testament manuscripts, There's an institute in Münster, Germany called the Institute for New Testament Textual Research, or INTF, are the initials for the German name. They've got the official number at 5,700. And when you take 967 divided by 5,700, you come up with 17%, not 10%. So he's off by half again as much. Now, at the same time, even if you only had 10%, that's a whole lot of manuscripts.
Yeah.
So let me just stress this. McClellan's statement is still misleading for at least 3 reasons. First of all, that's only the Greek manuscripts. I have no idea how many manuscripts in ancient translations we have through the first millennium, but it may be half again as much. So my guess is it's probably altogether between the Greek and these ancient versions, which especially is Latin and Coptic and Syriac. Those are the 3 earliest translations, and we have somewhere between 8 and perhaps 10,000 manuscripts in Latin alone. Again, that's spreading over the ages. We're basically cutting it off at the time of the printing press. There are some manuscripts that were produced after that were not based on a printed text, so we still count those as handwritten manuscripts, but there are just a few dozen that are real stragglers there. So we have about 1,500 manuscripts total in the first millennium, by the end of the first millennium, in all these languages. So secondly, the Greek and the versional witnesses are not our only evidence for the text of the New Testament. This is something that is conveniently omitted by many skeptics, namely the hundreds of thousands of quotations of the New Testament, perhaps even 2 or 3 million by now, by the church fathers. What's interesting is there's this place in Boiron, Germany, where they have been cataloging for many, many decades, over 100 years now, I believe, quotations and allusions to the New Testament by the church fathers in Latin. And at a certain point, I think in the 1970s, if I'm not mistaken, they hit over 1 million quotations of the New Testament by the Latin church fathers. How many more are there in Greek? You know, this is, the work is still ongoing. They publish every once in a while from this century, the quotations by the church fathers. And it was well over 1 million 50 years ago. And so my guess is it's probably 2 or 3 million quotations that have been found in the church fathers over all the ages. But this starts in the late 1st century, although really there in Clement and the Didache, we have mostly allusions rather than quotations. But we begin to get scores of church fathers quoting or alluding to the New Testament in Greek, Latin, and Syriac. Many of them wrote whole commentaries, like Origen in the first half of the 3rd century wrote this detailed commentary on John. He wrote a commentary on Romans that was 15 volumes. And we don't have the whole thing. What we do have is the 10-volume abridgment in Latin of Origen's commentary on Romans. But Origen did what is known as the hexapla, which is looking at 6 different languages for the Old Testament. His work, we don't have a complete copy of it because it was in multiple languages, these columns of listing what the variants were for the Hebrew Bible, the Syriac, and the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, other languages. It's a lifetime project that he did, and he was extremely careful to represent as accurately as he could what the manuscripts actually said. Now, Origen wrote commentaries, and he was not given to brevity. He wrote pretty extensively, and Origen, importantly, talked about textual variants. He would say, this is found in some manuscripts, this wording is found in others. I'll bring that up again a little bit later in our discussion. But I think it's important to recognize that you have these church fathers where we have whole commentaries by Origen, 3rd century, before we have the great majuscules. McClellan calls them uncials, but for the last 20 years, that word has gone out of vogue because uncial, UNCIL, is a CIAL, is really a term that is used for Latin manuscripts, not Greek. So we call these majuscules, which basically means capital letter manuscripts. A way to divide these is to think in terms of the capital letter manuscripts, the majuscules, and the lowercase manuscripts, the minuscules. The divide is right at about AD 1000. It's a little bit earlier than that, but basically you've got these capital letter manuscripts up until about 1000. We have some that come after that date, but we also have minuscule manuscripts, cursive handwriting, basically, that starts early in the 9th century. So even almost 200 years before that divide. But that's one of the ways we think about these manuscripts. Okay, so I don't want to get too far off track, but this is such a fun topic for me just to think.
For sure.
So I would say that, after Origen, then we already have Irenaeus commenting on Scripture and Justin Martyr in the 2nd century. We also have Tatian's Diatessaron, which we don't have any complete copies of, but we do have fragments. And Tatian put together the 4 Gospels in a way that kind of harmonized them. It was banned by later church fathers, not because it was heretical. It was not heretical. It's just that people wanted to read the Gospels as 4 individual accounts of the life and ministry of Jesus Christ, as we still do to this day. But what Tatian did was he was able to put together wording from various gospel manuscripts that he had access to. And from those fragments, we can see, and from the copies we have in other languages of Tatian's Diatessaron, we can see the variants that he knew about in his time. That's late 2nd century. So we've got that kind of material. Then you get into the 4th century with the great commentaries. You get Chrysostom, Basil the Great. You have others that write on commentaries on almost every book of the New Testament. And by the late 5th, early 6th, then I think we're basically complete in terms of commentaries. Even without writing commentaries, they would quote from these various books. For example, going back to Origen, he quoted from the Gospel of Mark on many occasions, although he did not write a commentary on Mark's Gospel. What he did was he wrote other documents, quite a few documents, and he'd quote Mark's Gospel in some of these places. And so we can find out the text of Mark that he had to some degree on the basis of his comments in all of his writings. Okay, so through the first millennium, as I said, we do have an embarrassment of riches. It's only when someone talks about the percentage of the total that the first millennium manuscripts seem small.
Yeah.
Only when you think in terms of percentages. And that's the interesting thing. It's kind of a sleight of hand that I see these skeptics doing. They will talk about the number of manuscripts in the early century. They claim there's only 4 in the 2nd century. That's probably a little bit low. But then they talk about percentages. They say, we have only 10% of the manuscripts through the 10th, which is not accurate. But that if it were 10%, we're still talking about 570 manuscripts. That's a huge amount. As I said, we have nearly 1,000 in Greek alone, about 1,500 probably, of all the languages through the first millennium. Now, by any standard, 1,000 manuscripts within 900 years of the completion of the New Testament is an embarrassment of riches. That is something that the scholars of classical Greek and Latin would just give their eye teeth to have, all those except for Homer. Homer has more copies of his Iliad than any other ancient Greco-Roman author does of their writings, except for the New Testament. As far as we can tell, about 10 times as many copies as Homer does of his. And the vast majority of Homer's copies, about 1,700, are fragmentary papyri, while as the vast majority of New Testament manuscripts, this is important, are over 400 pages long. In fact, that's the average size for a New Testament manuscript to be 400 pages long.
Mhm.
Okay, my wife says, get to the point. She always gets to the point. And, the older you get, the more garrulous you get. You get off track. And so you'll have to maybe bring me back on track on a rare occasion. But here you go. So regarding McClellan's count of the early papyri, his numbers need to be updated. The official registry at the INTF in Münster, this German institute, which is kind of the granddaddy of all text critical institutes, lists 6 papyri from the 2nd century, with one on the border between the 2nd and 3rd. And Eldon Epp, who is not a conservative scholar by any stretch, claimed that if we count papyri that are either late 2nd century or early 3rd, it's difficult to date some of the papyri more precisely. They don't put the date on these early manuscripts. We start getting dates in later manuscripts, but not in these early ones. So we have to do it by what's called paleography, doing comparisons of handwriting and other features in the manuscript that help us to date it within usually 50 to 100 years. Eldon Epp, when you look at these, all those that could possibly be 2nd century, the number is 11. And some of these papyri have been published in just the last 30 years.
Wow.
17 or 18 were published by the Egypt Exploration Society, the Oxyrhynchus papyri. It's a famous dig that was started in the late 1800s. Oxford University, the Ashmolean Museum, has the collection of most of those, and they boast perhaps the largest collection of Greek papyri in the world, about 500,000 papyri. That means papyrus fragments that actually have writing on them. That's just incredible. We have maybe about 1 million manuscripts on papyrus throughout the world. Now, of those, how many of them have been actually published of these Oxyrhynchus papyri? Well, I got one published with a couple of other scholars a couple of years ago, and it was number 5775. So about the same as the number of New Testament manuscripts is how many manuscripts they've published of the Oxyrhynchus papyri. That's about 1%. There's a whole lot more that need to be published, and they went through the archives and were able to find these 17 or 18 manuscripts in 1998, I believe, and get those published. There's more that are coming out, and we keep getting more. On average, we get another papyrus published about every year.
Nice.
It's kind of worked out that way. Okay.
Thanks.
So this is significant, and some of the 2nd century papyri have been discovered in the last few years. All right. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is not the only way to determine the date of a particular wording, because we have the church fathers. So let me see how the church fathers went on this. I'll give a couple of examples. Hold on just a second. I need to fix something here.
Sure.
Sorry.
Will you do that? I'm going to look at a couple of these super chats here.
Okay.
Drake says, I can't wait for Mr. Dan McClellan's 20-year-old arguments to try to debunk Christianity. Bart Ehrman, more like, well, that's just mean, sir. I'm not going to read that. Someone asked Dr. Wallace, what are the reasons you reject amillennialism?
That's not even on the topic.
Yeah, you don't have to. As I've said, you don't have to answer anything. If people want, in my perspective, you can see a video I did a while ago called "The End Times: A New Perspective," and so you can check that out. But anyway, get back to what you were going on. It was really interesting.
All right. Thank you for letting me take that little break.
Yep.
All right. I may need to make some more adjustments, but anyway, I'm an old man. I have hearing aids, and I need to get the treble and bass just right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So let me give you a couple of illustrations here. We have no manuscripts of Revelation chapter 13, verse 18 from the 2nd century. That's the text where John says, this calls for wisdom. The number of the beast is the number of a man, or it could be translated is the number of mankind. And his number is 666. We have no manuscripts from the 2nd century, but we do from the 3rd, 2 very, very important manuscripts. And I've had a chance to examine those in some detail. and then 4th and 5th and centuries on from there. But Irenaeus, in the second half of the 2nd century, wrote an entire, although short, chapter on the number of the beast. I mean, you ask anybody anywhere in the Western world, what's the Antichrist number? 666. Everybody knows that. Not so fast. Although he believed that the oldest and best manuscripts had the number 666. He also knew, this is Irenaeus, knew of some that had 616. Now today we have only 2 Greek manuscripts with the beast's number as 616. It's interesting, that number, the number, the way they used these numbers in the ancient world was through what's called gematria, where there's a letter representation for the number. And we didn't have the Arabic numbers in the 1st century, but so normally it was written out with Greek letters, 3 different Greek letters, or written out as the word 666 or 616. And 666 would work out, when you do the numerical equivalent of someone's name, it works out in both Greek and Latin to Neron Caesar, Nero Caesar, with an N on the end of Nero, because N is worth 50 points. But that's not the normal spelling for his name. You take those 50 points off that final N and you get the number 616. Now, there was this myth in the late 1st century that called the Nero Redivivus myth, which is that Nero would be resurrected from the dead. And that pretty much petered out in the 2nd century. For there to be any manuscripts that had the number 616, almost surely they came from that 1st century era.
Interesting.
Now, John's revelation was written about AD 195. About AD 95, not 195. As most scholars would affirm, before the end of Domitian's reign in 96. And John may have written 616. It's a difficult call. Most scholars would say it's still 666, not 616. And they would say, 616, that's not the number of the beast. That's the neighbor of the beast. He just lives a few doors down. But 616, Irenaeus spoke about he wrote a chapter on it, as I said, in the second half of the 2nd century, about AD 170. And he talked about the number of the beast. He said, I think the number of the beast is 666, not 616. And he went on and said, the oldest and the best manuscripts have 666. Now, what's interesting here is he's writing about 80 years after John wrote Revelation. And he's talking about different manuscripts already that have proliferated in one of the books that took the longest time to get accepted into the canon.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, this one may have taken longer than any other book, and yet there were copies already that he knew about, that he had access to. Now, we don't have those 2nd century manuscripts or late 1st century manuscripts, but what we do have is 2 manuscripts that come later. And one of those is from the early 5th century, perhaps the first decade of the 5th century. It's at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. It's Codex Ephremi Rescriptus. Rescriptus means it was written over on again. It's called a palimpsest. That's a manuscript that where the text was scraped off and then somebody wrote something else on top of it many centuries later. And the commentaries by Ephraim were put over the text of the original Greek. They were written, I think, in Syriac. So, if I recall, but that particular manuscript, I had the opportunity to look at the Bibliothèque Nationale, and it's on their grand reserve list of manuscripts. But they permitted me to look at that, as well as 3 or 4 other really important manuscripts very high on their list, and it was a great privilege to look at it. It's a palimpsest, which means that undertext was scraped off. And there was a scholar by the name of Konstantin Tischendorf who tried to figure out exactly what that undertext said. He spent 2 years on it. It's about 150 leaves of text, and it was originally the whole Bible. It doesn't have the whole Bible in it now, but it has rather large portions of it. And what's interesting is he was able to discern about 99% of what that original text had to say, which was amazing back in the 1830s, late 1840s, I think is when he did this. Yeah. So I had the opportunity to look at that manuscript, and at Revelation 13:18, it says, as plain as day, the number of the beast is 616. Now, it's just one manuscript, but it just so happens to be one of our two most important manuscripts for the book of Revelation. So here's a manuscript that seems to represent the wording that Irenaeus talked about in the 2nd century. We're waiting 250, 300 years later before we see any copies of this. So here you have these later manuscripts that tell you about earlier wording. And it's not an isolated example. This is the norm rather than the exception.
So on what you're saying there, when we get back to the main point, we do have this embarrassment of riches when we actually start looking at the data, getting in the nitty gritty. It's not, when we just look at the percentages, it doesn't look that great. But when we start going in, when we look at what that actually means in terms of quantity, when we look at quotes from the church fathers, when we look at some of these manuscripts, they're even the later ones are preserving traditions that are exceptionally early. So when you've said we got an embarrassment of riches, that's early for early, we really do, especially when we can compare it to other ancient works at that time.
Right. Yeah. I'll get to that here in just a second. I'll finish up on this because I'm looking at the clock. Oh, I'm taking up too much time on this first point. So it was not until 1998 where we knew of a second manuscript that had 616. That's one of those papyri that was published at Oxford University. And I had an opportunity to look at that manuscript in the flesh 4 years after it was published. And sure enough, it has the number of the beast as 616. It's interesting. It might actually say there's one letter before the 616 that if it's a single word, it means or. Here's a manuscript that might actually have said 666 or 616. It's a postage stamp size fragment. There's 26 fragments of Revelation over 9 chapters in this manuscript. P115 is the number of it, what it's known as. And I had a chance to look at that in the flesh. So I've looked at the only 2 manuscripts in the world that have the number of the beast as 616. But before those were known to exist, we still had Irenaeus's comments. Okay. Another example, and I'll just give this other one, then we'll move on, is Origen from the 3rd century, as we mentioned. He was commenting on a number of variants throughout the New Testament, and he talked about Matthew 27:16, about when Pilate said to the people on the Passover, I will release one prisoner for you, which was his custom to do every year. And he didn't want to execute Jesus, but there was this known thief and just a bad dude all the way around by the name of Barabbas. So he puts up his best example of a guy he would never want to crucify against Barabbas, who just deserved that 10 times over. He says, whom shall I release to you? Jesus, the one called Christ, or Barabbas? Or did you say Jesus, the one called Christ, or Jesus, Barabbas? We don't have any manuscripts that have Jesus before Barabbas in Greek until the 9th century. But Origen knew about that wording already in the 3rd century. So what I'm saying is it's kind of how important it is that we don't have the early manuscripts doesn't necessarily compute to that we don't know what the original said in those places. We have just tons of evidence, and we do have quite a few early manuscripts through the centuries. McClellan at one point in this said, well, you can cobble together the New Testament from the 4th century manuscripts. Yeah, you can cobble the New Testament together with one manuscript, Codex Sinaiticus, which is from the mid-4th century, and it has the complete New Testament. So that was a little bit of a misstatement on his part. Yeah. Okay, so that's some of the basics of the number of the manuscripts, the embarrassment of riches that we have when you look at the manuscripts, the versions, and the quotations by the church fathers. everybody in the ancient world would love to have more than that for theirs.
Excellent. So let's get back to the video. We're going to go to super chats in a little bit here, but let's go back in. I'm going to play about another 2 minutes and then we'll stop it again.
Also, there's an awful lot of variance in these early manuscripts. Among all these manuscripts, no two are exactly alike in every way. They all differ from each other, which is why when scholars create critical editions of the New Testament, they have to be eclectic editions, meaning there's not a single manuscript. They cobble together the critical edition from as many different existing manuscripts as they need to create the readings that they believe are the most likely. And the notion that we can have confidence because we have all these manuscripts that date to over 1,000 years after Jesus lived is just a ludicrous claim.
Now,
so we'll stop right there. We mentioned talking about the variants. Is there anything else you wanted to say on that? You talked a little bit about it. Is there anything you wanted to say more on the variants of the manuscripts?
So on this particular statement that he makes, okay, yeah, there's a number of things to say here. He's overstating the case, and it's quite misleading. First of all, let me agree with him in this way. All manuscripts, because they were done by hand, done by humans, have mistakes in them, every single one. There's no two handwritten manuscripts that are exactly alike. So how different are these differences? Well, let me talk about the quantity of differences and then the quality of differences. This is a way to think about. And by the way, if we have time, maybe we can come back later and talk about comparing the New Testament with other ancient literature and to see how many copies we have of various texts. What's interesting is skeptics almost never want to bring in other ancient literature and compare it to the New Testament copies in terms of date or number, because it's an embarrassment for them. Yeah. So, okay, the number of variants. Let me define what a variant is. A variant is any place between at least two manuscripts where there's a difference in wording. This can be as much as several verses, and there's two places where we have a dozen verses that are either in the text or not in the text, and there's only two like that. Then the next largest includes two verses. After that, we have about 14 or 15 that are one verse or more. That's it for the whole New Testament of nearly 8,000 verses. Okay, so in terms of the quantity of variants, it's any place where you've got at least two manuscripts that disagree, even as small as a single letter. We have approximately 1.5 million differences among our manuscripts in Greek alone. Now, Peter Gurry, that McClellan cites, and I'll cite here too, he wrote an article in a major journal, New Testament Studies, a few years back, where he did some comparisons on the basis of the best estimates from exhaustive examination in certain passages or books to see how many variants there were in the manuscripts at these places. And he came up with a number, an estimate, and it's the first estimate that really is based on solid evidence, that we have approximately 500,000 textual variances or differences among our manuscripts. What he explicitly did not count are differences in spelling and nonsense errors. Those make up the majority of the differences. For my examination, I'd say about 2/3 of the differences are either spelling differences or nonsense. So you might say, well, that's an awful lot of differences. Can we ever possibly recover the wording of the original? It's actually more than 10 times the number of words there are in the New Testament. Bart Ehrman has often said we have more differences in the manuscripts than we have in the words of the New Testament. About 138,162 words in the original Greek New Testament, give or take a few. So this is more than 10 times that. Can we possibly get back to the original? Actually, having this number of manuscripts and this number of variants is to our advantage. 300 years ago, a scholar by the name of Richard Bentley, who was a Cambridge Don, did some really, really serious work in the Greek New Testament. And in 1713, he published a book called Remarks Upon a Discourse of Free Thinking. Now, Richard Bentley had started to publish a Greek New Testament based on the available evidence that he had, which did not include particularly early manuscripts. I mean, we had one from the 5th century, two that were known, and some later ones. But in 1713, they didn't know about the earlier manuscripts. And yet, by the principles that he was able to put together, the few verses that he actually did publish on, the text looks almost identical to what scholars today would, as McClellan says, cobble together on the basis of the available evidence. I think that's kind of a pejorative word, saying that, you know, our Greek New Testament is looks like Frankenstein more than the original. But Bentley was defending a fellow by the name of John Mill. John Mill was an Oxford scholar who spent the entirety of his adult life, his entire academic career, finding as many differences among the manuscripts as he possibly could in the Greek manuscripts, as well as ancient versions and quotations by the church fathers. He spent 30 years on this volume. It's a big volume. CSNTM, my organization, has 2 copies of it, actually. And he was able to look at 99 Greek New Testament manuscripts. Well, we know about 5,700 today. So 99, that's not a whole lot. But after 30 years of work, he was able to put together 30,000 textual variants. It's a massive work where there's typically more text in the footnotes in the apparatus than there is in the actual printed text of the text that he was basing it off of. So there was an outcry by fundamentalist Christians. They said, what John Mill has done is the work of the devil. By the way, John Mill died exactly 2 weeks to the day after he got his magnum opus published. And that's the right way to go out. That's what I want to do. I want to get my final work done. 2 weeks later, die, go be with the Lord, so I don't have to face the critics and all their annoying. But anyway, it was left to Richard Bentley to defend John Mill. And so Bentley was addressing these fundamentalist Christians and the Roman Catholics. The fundamentalist Christians were saying what John Mill did was the work of the devil. You know, I don't think it's the work of the devil when we examine history. Right. In fact, this is the work that the incarnate Christ gives us a methodological imperative to do. Because when God became man in space-time history, what you've got is God subjecting himself to historical investigation. You've got the scripture doing exactly the same thing. The Bible is the only major religious book of any major religion that subjects itself wholly to historical investigation. You have talking head stuff in like the Gospel of Thomas and the Quran and, you know, the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita and the Compassionate Buddha. You don't have material out there that says this is when this happened in this place at this time and this guy was healed. You could go back to Peter's house. I've been to Peter's house twice in Capernaum, where Jesus healed the paralytic who was dropped through the roof by his 4 friends. We know that place. It's one of the most positively identified places in Israel. So the incarnation gives us that methodological imperative to examine the Bible historically. This is not the work of the devil. This is what the highest Christian calling could involve. What that means is Christians should never be afraid to ask the tough historical questions. We should pursue that wholeheartedly because all truth is God's truth and he will lead us in the right direction. Okay, so Bentley was responding to these fundamentalist Christians. He was also responding to the Roman Catholics who were saying, you Protestants have a paper pope. The difference is your paper pope disagrees with himself on every page, you know, because of the textual variants. So here's what Bentley wrote. He said, if there had been but one manuscript of the Greek Testament at the Restoration of Learning about 2 centuries ago, he's talking about 1516, when Erasmus published the first Greek New Testament on a printing press based on about 9 manuscripts. then we would have had no various readings at all if there had only been one manuscript. And would the text be in a better condition then than it is now that we have 30,000 variant readings? It is good, therefore, to have more anchors than one. Notice what he says. He's calling every additional manuscript an anchor, and another manuscript to join the first would give more authority as well as security. So he loves the fact that we have all these manuscripts with all these differences. And I've often suggested that what I'd like to do someday, and I will do it someday when I'm lecturing, is when I have an audience listen to me and they don't mind taking an extra 20 minutes or so, I want to read from a passage. I'll have to pass out pen and paper so they all can do this that way. Read from a passage they may have never heard from before, and I'll read for about 5 or 6 minutes, and then collect everybody's copies that they made. Now, what do you think I'll discover?
Variants.
I will discover mistakes in virtually all these manuscripts. Maybe not too many because it's only for 5 or 6 minutes, but they're all doing it from what I'm saying rather than actually them copying out a text that they're seeing, which would be far more accurate. And that's how virtually all of our New Testament manuscripts were copied, by sight, not by sound. It's a myth to say that they were copied by some lecturer reading a text to 20 scribes. That just didn't happen. So I could gather those up and have somebody else look at them, somebody who was trained in textual criticism, and they would be able to determine, I'm sure within a couple of letters, probably exactly what I actually originally said. Now, that's the reality when you have a number of manuscripts of the same era. We can get back to a much earlier text than that.
Right.
And I've done exercises like that. So that's talking about the number of variants. But what about, that's the number of them. What about the nature of these variants? That's where the rubber meets the road. So it's quantity versus quality, number versus nature. Variants or textual differences can be looked at in terms of meaningfulness and viability. So I've got this matrix, if you will, of meaningful and viable. And there's, just to see this in your mind's eye, 4 different squares. Those that are not meaningful and not viable. Those that are not viable, but they are meaningful. Those that are not meaningful, I'm sorry, not viable, but they are meaningful. There's 2 that have not, 2 that don't. So you got not meaningful, not viable, meaningful and viable, viable, not meaningful, and not meaningful, not viable. So 3 that have not in there, and then there's only one of these quadrants that has both meaningful and viable. Now, I think there's approximately, I've actually done this in lectures, shown something that's not quite to scale because it doesn't even look nearly as good as the reality. About 70% of the variants we have are nonsense spelling differences, things that are not even meaningful. Then you have those that are not viable, but they may be meaningful. That means the meaning of the text could change in some sense, but it doesn't mean that it's a viable reading. If you have some different wording that makes sense and it's found in one late manuscript, well, it's hardly likely that the original text just sifted through hundreds of years of copying without anybody catching it until some guy in the 14th century said, "Oh, I've got this right." That's a picture that is not worth paying. It's not going to be related to reality. The smallest category by far is those that are both meaningful and viable. And let me define these carefully. Viable means that it has at least a possibility of being the wording of the original, a decent possibility of going back to the original wording. Meaningful means it changes the meaning of the text in some way. It may be a very small way, but it does change the meaning of the text, not just the emphasis, but the meaning. Of all of our textual differences, less than 1/10 of 1% of all these variants are both meaningful and viable. Let me state that again. of all the textual differences that we know about in the Greek manuscripts, less than 1/10 of 1% of all these textual differences are meaningful and viable. That's the reality.
Yeah.
So, of course, there's going to be differences, lots of differences, but are they meaningful or are they viable? That's the question that McClellan doesn't ask. Let me give some examples. You can take the spelling and nonsense differences. And what's interesting is our earliest manuscripts were not copied by professional scribes. What we actually have evidence for is that many of the earliest manuscripts, the ones on papyri and even some of the majuscule manuscripts written on parchment in centuries later, they were copied by people who were trained largely as bean counters, accountants, CPAs, if you will. We have evidence of this from what C.H. Roberts published in 1977. He was a scholar who was the one who discovered P52, what is considered our oldest papyrus fragment of the New Testament, just 5 verses in John's Gospel, and from probably the first half of the 2nd century. So it's about the size of a credit card, very small, just parts of 5 verses. He published that in 1935. Well, 42 years later, he gives lectures at Oxford University, and he talks about the text of the New Testament in Egypt. And one of the things he pointed out was that of all the literary texts that he had looked at, he had only found one manuscript that had the words, the numbers not written out as words. You get into a literary text, the authors always wrote them out as words, and the copies were done by professional scribes who always wrote them out as words, rather than as numbers, like 666, something like that. Now, he found, though, at the same time, many of the early New Testament manuscripts, the papyri and even some of the majuscules, where they did not write the numbers out as words, but they used individual letters, and they drew a horizontal bar above those letters to indicate, don't read this as a word, read it as something else. And so you would read that as a number. P115, the manuscript I mentioned that has 616 that's at Oxford, it has just 3 letters, and there's a bar above it saying, read this as 616, not as these individual letters. So the fact is that we have a number of the New Testament manuscripts, the earliest ones in particular, that were not done by professional scribes. Well, what kind of people did do these? They weren't the creative sorts of folks who wanted to create myths and add to the stories and change the theology of the text. They were bean counters. Those people, generally speaking, you don't want to be too creative. Now, Bernie Madoff, he was an exception. That proves the rule, So what's interesting is the kinds of mistakes they made were not intentional. The unintentional mistakes, the changes that were made that the writer did not, or the scribe did not mean to make, are the ones that are the most easily detected. Let me give an illustration in English. Let's say you saw a manuscript of the Constitution. Somebody wrote it out maybe as a school exercise. And you're reading the preamble to the Constitution. It says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect onion." Not onion, the word is union. But it doesn't make sense to form a more perfect onion. So obviously that's a mistake that the student or the scribe was not as careful to correct along the way. That's what we have, especially in our earliest manuscripts. So you have to look at the quality of these variants. We're not talking about texts that are wildly different. But let me give an illustration, 2 illustrations of manuscripts of the Greek New Testament. Both of them, I think they're very interesting. They actually make sense in one way, but it's nonsense in another way. There's one of the manuscripts of 1 Thessalonians 2:7, where Paul says that we, namely he and Silas, when they visited the Thessalonians, were like little children among them. And then the next sentence starts out, as a nursing mother. Well, some New Testament translations say, we were like little children among you, like a nursing mother. Well, that's a little bit too harsh. It starts a brand new sentence. And in that chapter, 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, what Paul is doing is he's explaining his relationship to the Thessalonians using familial language. We were fathers, we were orphaned children, we were mothers, we were brothers. He uses all this language and he just flips the relationship all over the place.
Mhm.
But if we understand that he starts a new sentence when he says, as a nursing mother who cares for her children, then little children makes sense. That's a reading that the Net Bible was the first English translation to actually put in as the wording of the text. Most translations, up until the Net Bible came out in 2005 for the first edition, I think, maybe, right around then. What most translations have is, we were gentle among you, not little children. The difference in Greek is one letter. It's either the word napioi with an N or apioi without the N. And the word before ends in an N. And so Paul, I think, when he's dictating to his scribe, says egonathimen apian. The scribe may have heard egonathimen apian, or he may have heard egonathimen napian. But when the last word ends in a new, the second word, it's hard to tell. So most manuscripts have, we became gentle among you, but we have the oldest manuscripts, some of the oldest have, we became little children among you. Now, there's one manuscript, one late manuscript that, as I said, it makes sense in one way, but rather than napioi or apioi, it says hippoi. We became hippoi among you. That's the Greek word horses. We became horses among you. I don't think so. So in one sense, it makes sense. I mean, it makes grammatical sense, but another, it doesn't make any common sense at all. It's not the metaphor Paul would have used. And there's another manuscript from the 9th century, a very, very important manuscript of the Gospels that at John 1:15, I think, where John the Baptist says, after me comes a man who was before me, talking about the coming of the Messiah, Jesus. The word for man in Greek is aner. This particular manuscript, Codex L, is the letter that's assigned to it. The scribe has a very good tradition. He's copying from a very accurate ancient tradition, but he doesn't know how to spell worth beans. And so he said, after me came aer. He dropped the new. Aer is the Greek word air. After me came air. Well, it makes grammatical sense, but it makes no theological sense. It's worth spit. So anyway, you get those kinds of things in the manuscripts that I think are really, really funny to look at. Now, I've asked a question of my Greek students, and I've done this when I've lectured on the reliability of the text of the New Testament. How many ways can you say John loves Mary in Greek? Have you had Greek?
I have not, no.
Oh, okay. Well, so this is a question I asked my Greek students, and sometimes they'll be in these audiences where they can try to figure this out. And in Greek, the word order could be any order for John loves Mary. The way you tell what the subject is, what the direct object is by the endings on those words. And using the exact same verb each time, and not putting it into the passive, like Mary is loved by John, but John loves Mary. I've asked them, how many ways can you say John loves Mary in Greek? Well, you can also not just change the word order, but you can add the article, the word the, that's not always translated, before John or Mary or both or neither. On top of that, there's 2 different ways to spell John and 5 different ways to spell Mary in the manuscript. When you look at all of that, and on top of that, there's little particles that are often untranslated. And on Greek quizzes, I'll say, give me the definition of this word. And they'll say, this is an untranslatable particle that expresses contingency or means something else. So there is no translation for it sometimes.
Mhm.
So I've asked this question, and I spent 8 hours one day writing out all the different ways that you can say John loves Mary in Greek. And when I got all done, I realized, oh, there's a whole bunch that I left out. 384 ways.
Wow.
To say John loves Mary in Greek. And it means exactly the same thing every time. The only difference is in a slight emphasis. Is it John loves Mary, or John loves Mary? So then I realized, oh, I could have used a periphrastic construction. So it would have been over 500 ways to say it just without. I got 384. I figured I'd prove the point. And I show all 384 of them when I give a lecture on this. It's really fun to watch.
Interesting.
Glaze over, So, over 500 ways to say it. Then you put the periphrastic construction in, it's over 1,000.
Wow.
Now, what if we used a different verb for loves that's loves that's almost synonymous with the first? Now we have over 2,000 ways to say it. It's just remarkable how many ways you can say the same thing where the meaning is not changed. And Bart Ehrman, in his book Misquoting Jesus, says we could go on nearly forever talking about specific places in which the texts of the New Testament came to be changed, either accidentally or intentionally. The examples are not just in the hundreds, but in the thousands. He's absolutely right. But the number of the variants is meaningless. What is the nature of those variants? You could literally have tens of millions of differences in our manuscripts without changing the meaning at all anywhere.
Yeah, I think that's an important point you bring up. I mean, we have a lot of these variants, but I mean, remember, as you know, the meaningful and viable ones, they're 1/10 of 1%, and again, they're not really changing in terms of a lot of what's going on in the text, as you gave some examples. Remember, you brought up Romans 5:1. There's some early variants that say we have peace with God. There's others that say let us have peace with God. Right. Meaningful, viable, but I mean, not a big deal in terms of what's going on in Romans. We get a good picture there. So.
Yeah, what it does is, and that's one of the examples I was going to use. You stole all my thunder, and that's fine. It's just a single letter difference in Greek, and they both are pronounced the same, omega or Omicron, which was a long O in the first century. So it's either echomen or echomen. Yeah. So basically, on something like that, it does affect the meaning in that passage. And it may actually affect the outline of Romans to a degree. But both of those, I'm sorry, I keep bumping on my computer. Both of those are variants that Paul could easily affirm. He says to Christians, have peace with God. He says to them, you have peace with God. He says, be reconciled to God. Other places, he says, you have been reconciled to God. So in different senses, he could mean either one. So neither one is in any way a contradiction with what Paul says. Let me give just a couple of other examples of meaningful and viable differences. John 4:1, we have in our standard Greek New Testaments and in most modern translations. Now, when Jesus knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, and then it goes on in verse 2, although he himself was not baptizing, but his disciples were, then it goes on, it says he left Judea and went into Galilee. That's in verse 3. So the first phrase, now when Jesus knew, there are manuscripts that instead of having Jesus have when the Lord knew. And consequently, it's a meaningful variant. It's probably not what the original wording is. John doesn't seem to use the Lord or kurios, the Greek word for Jesus, except a couple of times before his resurrection. So it's not typically a Johannine expression. But let's say we have 1,000 manuscripts that have the Lord. We actually have more than that, I think, that have the Lord there. It changes the meaning to some degree, but there's not a single manuscript that says, now when Peter knew, or when John, or Mary, or somebody else. It's all pointing to Jesus. It has to do with the translation and how John is presenting Jesus Christ in his gospel. Here's one that's a little bit more meaningful. And I think in terms of orthopraxy, not orthodoxy, what we believe, but what we do, this may be the leading example where orthopraxy could be changed by the variants. In Mark chapter 9, verse 29, we read that the disciples had been trying to cast out demons, and they were unsuccessful with this particular person. And they came to Jesus and said, "Hey, what's the deal here? We couldn't cast the demons out." And Jesus said, "This kind can only be cast out by prayer." Or he said, "This kind can only be cast out by prayer and fasting." Well, which is it? And fasting is found in very important early manuscripts, and so is just prayer. It's the only place where we have prayer and fasting as a regulative principle for anything in the Christian life. Up until that time, the Pharisees fasted, Eastern Orthodox fast, the Catholics fast, but it's not a regulative principle for Protestants except in exorcisms. Now, I've been involved in a couple of exorcisms of houses, not persons. And I'm not sure whether it's just prayer or prayer and fasting. So to hedge my bet, I made sure not only to pray ahead of time, but also to fast. So
Good.
I'm really not sure. So it does affect orthopraxy in the Western world on some rare occasions. So those are examples of meaningful and viable. I'll talk about some others that are perhaps a little bit more interesting a little later, I think. But
well,
anyway, you get the idea of
I think those examples kind of summed it up there. The variants really aren't threatening Christian doctrines, which we'll talk about later.
Yeah.
We have a question coming in. He says, Dr. Wallace, how do we know the New Testament was preserved from the autographs until our earliest remaining copies? I guess he's talking about the titles on some of the books there. Perhaps that's what he's trying to ask there, I would say.
Is that, well, I don't know if that's the question. Because
I know the New Testament was preserved from the autographs. And okay, yeah, my mistake. Yeah, he was. But so actually,
the originals. Yeah,
actually, this is a great question because Dan McClellan is about to make this point in the video. So why don't we just play that?
Yeah,
we'll respond to this super chat in that as well, and that'll be perfect. So let's put that up here, and we'll play this next section.
Are there manuscript variants? Yes, there are. But those variants are so small. Like, is the word singular or plural? Is it a definite or an indefinite article? There is nothing that is changed by those variants.
So this is also factually incorrect. There are significant variants in the manuscripts that we have, but I'm not so much concerned for how the manuscripts were changed after we get our earliest witnesses to these texts. My concern is for the 1 to 2 century gap between the original composition of these texts and our earliest manuscript witnesses, because we can't account for how much has changed in that gap. Now, there are textual critics like Peter Gurry who will argue that we are safe assuming either that absolutely nothing changed between the composition of the text and our earliest manuscript witnesses, or that based on the manuscripts that are available, we can confidently reconstruct every last syllable of the text of the New Testament as they came from the pens of the original authors. That strikes me as incredibly irrational. We don't know what's in there, and there's plenty of evidence for significant editorial changes to these texts.
Now watch.
So Dan basically says in that few century gap, we have evidence of like significant changes that could have happened. That seems kind of like a little bit of a logical leap, but I want to know your thoughts on that specifically. Is this true? What do you make of this?
It's an argument that is often made, and it goes back to Helmut Kuster, I believe, who is a professor at Harvard, New Testament Early Christianity. And he argued that the wildest period of copying is in the century after original manuscripts were produced, original writings. There is a scholar, I won't mention his name until I get some verification from him that I can use this information, but he told me earlier this year that he contacted about 40 or 50 classical Greek and Latin scholars, and he asked them Helmut Christer said this is widely known. Everybody in the classical world knows this. And he asked them, is this true? Are the manuscripts that come within a century or two after the originals, is that the wild period of copying? And everyone except one said no. And one guy said, where did you get this information from? So it's interesting that's kind of, it's one of those myths that because it's been repeated so often, it must be true.
Right.
At the same time, McClellan is right in one sense. The earliest copies were done without any controls throughout much of the Roman Empire. Now, that's an important point. People began to make copies for personal use in the earliest period. And in some regions, through the majority of the Roman Empire, in fact, there was somewhat wild copying in some of these areas. But wild doesn't mean what McClellan seems to imply. It means that they've got differences in wording, and some verses are clipped, sometimes they're added to. But are they giving you a radically different picture of Jesus? That's not the case. Mm-hmm. But here's the interesting thing. Because there weren't controls, there was no agenda. So the early church didn't have an agenda to say, let's make sure that we get rid of all the heretical views of Christ and just promote the view that says he's God in the flesh. They didn't have that as an agenda. There was one place that did have an agenda, and that was to get accurate copies. There was no theological agenda. It was rather to make accurate copies. So you had what's called the Western text, which is now no longer even used. It's just found in a few manuscripts and a number of Latin church fathers in particular, where the text seems to be markedly different from that of some of our earliest Alexandrian or Egyptian manuscripts. But that Western text is an outlier. And they would, because there weren't these controls, it's difficult for someone to have an agenda to make them all go in one direction. Just imagine all these church fathers, and they're not saying the same thing. In fact, the Western text has been called a myth to call it something like a text because there was no recension. It just goes all over the map. But you can get back to the truth, just like Richard Bentley said you could. But in one area, there was no agenda except for careful copying. And let me explain this. I'm going to give some quotes. It was Alexandria, Egypt, and the environment around Alexandria. In the 2nd century BC, strict rules for copying manuscripts were articulated by the highly vaunted scholar Eratosthenes, who was the head librarian at the Library of Alexandria. Alexandria boasted the largest and most influential library of the ancient world. They attempted to have a copy of every single book that was written in Greek and Latin in the library. Now, it was burned down a couple of times over the centuries, but this is the 2nd century BC when Eratosthenes, the head librarian, is laying out some guidelines on how copying should be done. Careful copying of manuscripts was done there, and it was second to none. There was one agenda, getting the text copied accurately. Eratosthenes' influence had an impact on the works copied in Alexandria and Egypt for centuries to come. One of the evidences of this, and we start to see this in these Alexandrian manuscripts, is what's called a diarthotes. That's a person who checked the work of a manuscript before it left the scriptorium. And a diarthotes would make corrections on a manuscript. Now, some scholars have looked at just the original writing of a manuscript, but there was a recent work done by, I can't remember his last name, but and he'll kill me for this, but I won't even mention his first name because then he'll know who I'm talking about. But where he looked at the original hand and then the corrections that were also made by that same scribe, and the corrections were more accurate because it was done against the exemplar that was being copied. And so, like, if you're copying out your homework and then you're proofreading it, you're going to make corrections against that exemplar. I like to use the illustration of a professor grading quizzes, Greek quizzes. What are you going to trust? The student who got a 70 on a quiz, or the corrections that the Greek professor made. I think the latter is going to be a little bit more accurate to what the questions were supposed to be answered as.
Yeah.
Okay, so quite a bit, if not most, of classical Greek literature was written long before Eratosthenes, during the golden age of the 5th and 4th centuries BC. The early copies of that literature may well have suffered from inaccuracy, but the New Testament was written 300 years after Eratosthenes' copying rules had been established. I'm sorry, 200 years, not 300. It should not be surprising that the Greek manuscripts associated with Alexandria are both our oldest and our best manuscripts. And Metzger and Ehrman again. Ehrman is not an evangelical. I think he's the #1 skeptic against the Christian faith in America today. And I've known him for going on 43 years now. We've been friends for a long time. We've debated each other, but he has argued. He's kind of been the source that so many skeptics use to make their arguments. But here in this book that he co-authored with Bruce Metzger that came out in 2005, The Text of the New Testament, it's the standard introduction to New Testament textual criticism used today. They said on page 312, it is widely agreed that the Alexandrian text was prepared by skillful editors trained in the scholarly traditions of Alexandria. The text on which they relied must have already been ancient in all important points. The textual tradition that is represented by Aleph, B, P75, etc., they go on and say goes back to an archetype that must be put early in the 2nd century. So when you have the confluence of these really important Alexandrian manuscripts where they agree with each other, the reading goes back very early, at least to the early 2nd century, within decades of the completion of the New Testament, and most likely going back to the original in I'd say most of those places. They go on and say, actually 30 pages earlier, they say this: it would be a mistake to think that the uncontrolled copying practices, this is what McClellan talks about, that led to the formation of the Western textual tradition were followed everywhere the texts were reproduced in the Roman Empire. In particular, there is solid evidence that in at least one major see of early Christendom, the city of Alexandria, there was conscious and conscientious control exercised in the copy of the books of the New Testament. Alexandria had a long history of classical scholarship. It is no surprise then to find the textual witnesses connected to Alexandria attest a high quality of textual transmission from the earliest times. It was there that a very ancient line of text was copied and preserved. It's a very pure line, copying a very pure line, going back largely to the original wording.
That's incredible.
Yeah, when you make irresponsible statements that it's wild copying and all of the copies in the ancient world, early times, were wild, that just it doesn't compute. And one of the interesting things we can look at here is, just as a verification, there's a couple of ways you can verify this, but church fathers are really important, and so are these early translations of the New Testament. We have the Latin translation being done as early as the late 2nd century. The Syriac and the Coptic coming in the early 3rd century, most likely. And we have thousands of manuscripts in these traditions. And you go back to the earliest forms of them. And one of the things that we see in translations is there tends to be a status quo of how that translation is done for many, many decades, even centuries after the initial translation is done. Now, we get that in English translations too. The King James Bible comes out in 1611. It's too much work to go back and revise everything in light of the manuscripts. In fact, in 1627, Codex Alexandrinus was gifted to the King of England by Cyril Lucar, who was the ecumenical patriarch of the Patriarchate in Byzantium or Constantinople. And he, Codex Alexandrinus, an early 5th century, perhaps late 4th century manuscript, originally having the whole Bible in it. And That's 16 years after the King James Bible came out. Had the King James translators seen that ahead of time, the King James Bible would have a much longer than a 270-year history before you get the next committee done translation. And they perhaps still be in the majority today, which has been superseded by the NIV. There's far more copies of the NIV than the King James Bible now. 1661, they made some revisions, but without reflecting on what Codex Alexandrinus had to say. 1762, 1769, they made some more revisions. Almost all of these were just spelling changes. There's this status quo that happens once the labor of getting a translation into a different language takes place. And English translations today, they're not putting out a revision every 2 years, but maybe every 20 years or every 40 years or something like that.
Yeah.
So this is something that happened in the ancient world too. So you go back to the oldest Latin manuscripts and you can see certain things that represent the Greek exemplar that was there in the 2nd century. The same with the Coptic and the Syriac. You can see what the Greek exemplar must have said long before we have complete manuscripts of the New Testament in Greek.
Wow.
So this kind of evidence is vast, and it's interesting. The Coptic, which I think is the most important of these early translations, really agrees largely with the Alexandrian Greek manuscripts because it's done in Egypt. So there, there's just a ton of evidence to look at. I'll have to stop there. I could go on to a lot of other things.
That's incredible. Yeah. I really appreciate you that. Yeah, that was very interesting on the Alexandrian. And so, yeah, I think that gives us a lot more confidence than the picture Dan McClellan was painting. So I really appreciate you bringing that. Yeah. So.
Skeptics are going to want to give some of the evidence, and some of what he has to say corrects what Cliff said. And I applaud that. But he also makes misstatements himself.
Yeah. The super chat here says, what's up with the woman caught in adultery passage not being in our earliest manuscripts? And can we trust that event happened or not?
That's a great question. The story of the woman caught in adultery, known as the pericope adulterae in Latin, is what I would call my favorite passage that's not in the Bible. At least in my view, I don't think it was original with John.
Yeah.
The vocabulary, the syntax are different from John's in massive ways. In fact, it looks more like Luke's gospel than it does John's.
I've heard that. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a whole family of manuscripts that places it at the end of Luke chapter 21 during the Passion Week. One of my students wrote an article in a major journal, Novum Testamentum, where he talked about the two different forms of the pericope adulterae that actually floated around in the ancient world. And there were two different forms that by the 3rd century got coalesced into one form. Papias knew about one, and he talks about that. Papias was an early 2nd century author, and he talks about this woman who was caught in adultery, but it's not the same story exactly. What's interesting is Papias, who was a disciple of John the Apostle, may well have known him personally, says this story is found in the gospel to the Hebrews, not the gospel of John. John's gospel would be the furthest removed from being the gospel to the Hebrews of just about any of the gospels. That's not the one he's talking about. So he knew of a tradition in a different gospel that no longer exists. We know about the gospel to the Hebrews, and we might have fragmentary quotes of it here and there, but it's not one of the inspired gospels. We have about 20% of our manuscripts do not have the story of the woman caught in adultery. And those that do put it in 5 different places. It's a story that was trying to get into the canon, trying to get it into the New Testament somehow, and the scribes weren't sure about the best place to put it. Some of them put it as a freestanding story between Luke and John. Others put it as a freestanding story after all 4 gospels, after John's gospel. Some put it at the end of Luke 21, and there's 3 different locations in John 7 where it belongs. The story ended up fitting the best after John 7:52, so it occupies John 7:53 through 8:11. The question then is it historical? Now, I've not done justice to the arguments for the inauthenticity of this, but I've written a little bit on this. Many others have done a great deal of work on the story of the woman caught in adultery. We even found some manuscripts when we were in Albania. CSNTM has discovered about 60 New Testament manuscripts, and some of those in Albania did not have the story of the woman caught in adultery. Normally, the later you get, the more frequently you will have it, except in manuscripts that have commentaries. A lot of our manuscripts have commentaries by church fathers, but there was no commentary written on the story of the woman caught in adultery until the second millennium. So if you have a manuscript that has commentary in it, it typically will not have this story. So we found some manuscripts that did not have it and that were not commentary manuscripts. And we found some manuscripts that were very late, like 14th, 15th century, that still did not have it. One of the manuscripts that we discovered in Albania, the manuscript didn't have it. It was a non-commentary manuscript. And then the next page, as we're photographing these, it was a parchment manuscript. And there was a piece of paper that was stitched into the following page in the gutter towards the spine, the inside of the book, with 5 big stitches. It had it looked like somebody was angry throwing this into the text. You don't have the story of the woman caught in adultery. I'm going to stick it in. And then he scribbles out that story. And on the back side of this, where he finishes it, now you see in the last half of that, on the back side of this single page, in a child's hand, the story of the woman caught in adultery. It must have been some priest or pastor who had children. And so you get this kid hearing him talk at dinner time. He says, I'm going to help Dad too, and I'll write this out again. So we have it twice in that manuscript, but all later. So I'd say, did it happen historically? I think there's a couple of issues that are important for us to clarify. Something may be true historically, even if it's not recorded in Scripture. And when someone says, well, if it's not part of the Bible, it didn't happen historically, really, then you're going to have a problem with most of ancient history and most of ancient Greco-Roman or even Jewish history. We've got, quite a bit of it in other writings, and that gives us the historical details. We may have greater confidence in Scripture that what it is accurate. But this story does have the earmarks of authenticity in some ways.
Okay.
And what my student did was he worked through the 2 different versions of this that got coalesced, I believe, in the 3rd century. And the Lucan form does not have, apparently, the Pharisees peeling off from the oldest to the youngest when Jesus says, let him who has no sin cast the first stone. And so that Lucan form doesn't have that as far as we can tell. There's some other features that are not there, but most of it, I'd say, is a true story. It almost surely happened something like this, but not exactly like this.
I see. That's a good point. I appreciate you saying that.
And now, then you have the question that you have to ask of pastors. Is this something you would preach if you don't believe it's part of the original text? That's a different question, and we won't get into that today.
Thank you, Max, for becoming a channel member. Let's reclaim Constantinople. Says Dan, we need to get you back to the glorious Queen of Cities again. Hagia Sophia still cries for your expertise.
Oh, I would love to go back to Constantinople, and in fact, I will be back there this year.
Excellent.
I just can't tell when I'm going to be, but I will be. We photographed the manuscripts at the Ecumenical Patriarchate there in 2004. Spent 3.5 weeks working 22-hour days, 3 of us.
Wow.
Working in our apartment, burning DVDs, and then we'd go do the work at the library, and then it was brutal work, but gosh, it's so rich to do that. We've got to preserve God's word, and digital preservation is how we can do it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Maxwell asked, would you have any suggested readings on complementarianism versus egalitarianism? Are you willing to share your views? My view is I think it's a false dichotomy. I think both are right in various ways. I don't know any good discussions on it, unfortunately. It's not really a topic I've studied that much. And that's not really the topic of the stream. Fisherman's Corner sent in a generous super chat. He said, I bought multiple NET full note and journal editions because of Dan's work on it. So we appreciate that for sure. So, yeah. Let's get back to the video here. I think I want to stop it 2 more times, and we've covered a lot of the meat of it. So I hope, I think these next couple we won't spend too much time on.
Watch out. Bart Ehrman is head of the religion department at UNC Chapel Hill, where we will be in a few weeks. And he wrote a book that was a bestseller. And in this book, he writes, there are between 200 and 400,000 manuscript variants. Differences in those Greek manuscripts. 200 to 400,000. So how can you have any degree of certainty that you have an accurate book? Well, what is also true is those 200 to 400,000 manuscript variants are located in 25,000 manuscripts, which means you have 8 to 16 manuscript variants per manuscript.
So this is misrepresenting Ehrman. He didn't argue that it was across 25,000 manuscripts. He argued that it was across the Greek and the Latin, which total about 15,700 manuscripts. But also trying to evenly spread out the variants across these 15,700 manuscripts to get as small a number as possible for each manuscript ignores that as time goes on, there are fewer and fewer variants. In other words, the variants are concentrated in the earlier manuscripts. So they are front loaded. We have a lot more variants in the earlier manuscripts. So Cliff here is being rather misleading with his representation of these data.
We have an incredibly high degree of certainty that we really have what those eyewitnesses wrote.
No, we don't. And also the scholarly consensus is that the Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses.
So let's stop there briefly. I did a 15-part series. The playlist is still on my channel. Mike Lacona helped with it. Luke Vandewey, Stephen Boyce. 15-part series arguing the Gospels are eyewitness accounts or did get their information from eyewitnesses. So you want to check that out. Anyone wants to see that, it's under channel, playlist, boom, all 15 videos, over 6 hours of content there. But what are your thoughts on this? Do you think McClellan is right here, or what is your take on this?
That's really irresponsible to say. There's a scholarly consensus that the Gospels are not based on eyewitness testimony. Matthew and John, the early church believed, were written by Matthew and John, the apostles. And I think that is a true accounting of that. There's certainly not a scholarly consensus against that. There is a scholarly consensus among liberal scholars, but liberal scholars do not make up the whole of scholarship. Bart Ehrman in one of our debates said there's not a single scholar at any state university in America that agrees with you on a particular point. Well, there's a reason why that's true, and that is because these state universities in America wouldn't allow somebody like me to be a professor of New Testament because of my conservative viewpoints. You flip that over and you go to the UK, and it's a different matter. One of the things that's important, I think, to catch here is what McClellan is doing. He's just appealing to names and numbers. You know, there's scholarly consensus. Well, that's really a general, broad statement, which is hardly the case. In the UK, they never dealt with the problem of modernism versus fundamentalism that we did in America. That cultural divide in the early 20th century changed education, theological education in this country. It was exemplified when Gresham Machen left Princeton Theological Seminary, where he was a professor, and he founded Westminster Seminary in the early 20th century. And what he did by doing that was he separated evangelicals from more liberal scholars. I personally think that was a mistake. I think he should have stayed in there and fought there. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is 50 years later, actually 30 years later, you get a guy like Bruce Metzger, who's now the head of the department. He died, 20 years ago, but he was the head of the department at Princeton Seminary of New Testament and was a conservative scholar. So it kind of came back full circle. But in the UK, they didn't have this divide. You had liberalism and modernism on one side, and then the Christian reaction of, all of this is bad, so we're going to deny everything, which was an overreaction on their part. And it separated the two camps into schools of animosity. In the United Kingdom, you will have in the very same department someone who is a strong evangelical Christian, somebody who's a liberal scholar, and they'll have no problem having friendly dialogue with one another. It's a problem that we face in our country, and that whole thing is now played out in politics, which I think is just a total mess. When Christians start lining up on either side as if that's the most important thing in the world, But we won't get into the politics here tonight. But the point is that he's appealing to a consensus that he finds in liberal circles, which is not the case elsewhere. And as I said, even in the UK, you get people like Paul Foster, who's a professor at Edinburgh University. You get guys at Cambridge University that several scholars there, Simon Gathical, Dirk Jonken, Peter Williams, others that teach New Testament at Cambridge, and others that you could just go right down the line at these UK schools, and you've got conservatives and liberals discussing, dialoguing with each other, friendly discussion, respectful discussion. And the whole idea of having a consensus opinion is nonsense. The evidence that we have that these go back to eyewitnesses is really significant. I was going to mention some comparisons about other ancient Greco-Roman literature. And let me just, this is a good place to bring this in because I know we're going to run out of time here pretty soon. But Thucydides was one of the fathers of history. He lived in the 5th century BC in the 400s, and he wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War. What Thucydides did was he tried to be as accurate as he possibly could without giving subjective opinions too much on the Peloponnesian War. He became the model for historians from that point on. And Herodotus, in the 4th century BC, called the father of history, learned a lot of this right from Thucydides, who wrote 100 years earlier. We have about 100 manuscripts of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War in Greek today. And the most important of these are from the 9th to the 15th century. So we're talking about manuscripts that are 1600 years after that, and they are the best manuscripts we've had. We have some early fragments from the 2nd century, very small, but the oldest complete manuscript comes 1600 years after Thucydides wrote. But what we do know is that Luke patterned his writings, his gospel and his book of Acts, after Thucydides. And there have been some good works on this about Luke as historian and theologian. That was actually the title of one scholarly book on Luke, where he was a great historian and a great theologian. When Paul was in prison in Caesarea, Luke surely traveled around Israel and interviewed people, so he could write his gospel. Paul was in prison for 2 years. And then when he was about to be released or have a trial, it looked for all the world like he was going to be freed. Paul says, I appeal to Caesar. Well, that was a stupid thing, Paul. You're going to be in prison for another couple of years. The right to a speedy trial meant you'd be in prison for 2 years. And after that, in Roman law, you had to either have a trial or be set free. Well, it wasn't stupid after all. Paul had told the Romans, I'm eager to see you also who are in Rome. He just never did get there as a free man, but as a prisoner. And so that's what he wanted to do, was get to Rome, which is where he ultimately died. So Paul, now I lost, I'm an old guy. That's why I lose my place on these things. Okay. I'm sorry. I'm talking about Luke. Thanks for the reminder. You're a lot of help. So Luke probably wrote his book of Acts while Paul was finishing up his time in that Roman prison. And there's some evidence. There's actually quite a bit of evidence, and more scholars are coming to embrace this, but it's not a consensus, that Luke wrote the book of Acts as kind of a trial brief for Theophilus, who may have been the attorney for Paul, to get him out of prison so he could continue spreading the gospel. You have the book of Acts starts with a bang and it ends with a whimper. You got I appeal to Caesar, then you got 8 chapters going on and on and on about this trial that never comes, and then the book just ends with Paul preaching freely under house arrest for the last 2 years. That's it.
Yeah.
Some scholars have said that's the most poorly ended book in the history of books. Unless Luke is saying, Theophilus, you write the next chapter. Do what you can to get Paul out of prison. And it's interesting that Luke even gives a hint about this, that his first book, the Gospel, was about the things that Jesus began to do and to teach. What do you mean began to do and teach? That's all of his teaching and doing was in the Gospel of Luke. No, he began to do this. He continued doing it through his apostles. And Theophilus can continue to spread the gospel by arguing for Paul's freedom. So it's interesting how these little subtle hints are there. But Luke is patterning his book of Acts after Thucydides and his gospel after Thucydides. He must have interviewed a number of people. There's a great likelihood that he interviewed Mary for the first 3 chapters of his gospel. There's some interesting indications that suggest this. And what's also interesting is Luke, when he quotes from Jesus, there's scholars speak about quotations as in one of 3 categories, either ipsissima verba, which is the very words of somebody. The ancients didn't think that they had to quote exactly the words of somebody as much as they thought, well, we need to get the basic idea of what they're saying right. And then the next one is ipsissima vox, the very voice is what that means, where the ancients were concerned to make sure they got the gist of what somebody said right, but not necessarily the words. And you can do a comparison in the Gospels to see how they're talking about the exact same event, and you got Jesus saying different things in one gospel as opposed to another, but they get the gist right. But when it comes to Luke, his syntax and his vocabulary for when Jesus speaks is different from his own. John is on the opposite end of the spectrum. He's putting everybody's conversation in his own words, including Jesus. Jesus and Pharisees, they all speak the same kind of Johannine syntax and vocabulary. But Luke has a special syntax for Jesus. And there's a likelihood that he got much, much closer to the actual wording of the people that he's quoting in his gospel and in the book of Acts. So there was an article published in Catholic Biblical Quarterly by Brian Wright on using syntax as a criterion of authenticity for the words of Jesus, which is criteria of authenticity has to do with how do we know that Jesus said something or did something. And there's historical tests that you remove theology entirely from the perspective, just look at it historically, and what can we conclude? Brian Wright originally did this as a term paper in advanced Greek grammar for me. He got his doctorate down in Australia. He's a great scholar. But Brian did this article using syntax where he pointed out that Jesus' syntax is different than Luke's syntax in his gospel. There's evidence like this. There's lots of other evidence. Here's one of the basic things. Bart Ehrman has talked about how he wrote a book called Forged, which is a popular treatment of his more academic book on pseudepigraphy, or how the books that are claimed to be by New Testament apostles and others, and they have those names ascribed to them, are not really by these people. So Paul only wrote 7 of the 13 letters ascribed to him. The Catholic epistles are not authentic, and it goes through none of the gospel written by eyewitnesses. They're all written by Gentiles in another land. That's a convenient way to say I don't need to deal with the issues of what you're really saying. There have been that kind of a viewpoint. He doesn't mention a single word in Forged about church fathers. Starting at the very beginning, there's unanimous testimony that the Gospel of Matthew was written by Matthew.
Yes.
The Gospel of Mark was written by Mark, Luke by Luke, and John, either by John the Apostle or by some disciple named John. Mostly it's John the Apostle, and the disciple, also named John, may have written Revelation, or it may have been John the Apostle, but that's not the Gospels. So you have this testimony that's early and universal, unanimous, complete consensus among the church fathers on these gospel authorships. That's incredible. So are we going to throw that evidence out while we're just going to go with modern consensus when we're 2,000 years removed?
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Good point. Yeah. All right, let's finish the video out, then we'll get to some of the questions and the super chats.
The idea that the Council of Nicaea put together the New Testament is false.
It's 100% correct.
The way you know that is by reading the early church fathers, who begin to list the Gospels and also other of Paul's writings. Now, was there some debate about the authenticity of a book like Hebrews, or 2nd and 3rd John, or 2nd Peter? Yes, there was. Did that debate go on into the 2nd century and 3rd century? Yes, it did. But it was not the church that got a council together and pulled a power move and decided, we're just going to reject the Gnostic Gospels because we don't like them. Baloney.
I think I would mostly agree with this. The canonization of the New Testament was a long, slow process that was mainly run by the congregations and what texts they considered appropriate to read in their services. And so there were some thought leaders within early Christianity who began to go see what texts the congregations were using and put together lists of what was considered authoritative. And that was the main driving force in the development of the New Testament canon. The Gnostic literature was a little more complex. There were certainly church leaders who railed against the Gnostics and their literature, but I also think it would be misleading to say that they sat down around a big table and decided, hey, I don't like this stuff, let's just get rid of it. This was another process of long-term discourse and debate between all different kinds of leaders and members of these church congregations.
The tests that the church used to determine what was going to be in the New Testament, what are the 27 books of the New Testament? The tests were really simple. Was it written by an eyewitness or by somebody who knew an eyewitness, like Luke and obviously Paul? And secondly, was it accepted by the worldwide church around the Mediterranean? If the book was simply accepted in Alexandria, Egypt, but not in Antioch or not in Rome, it was not accepted as part of the canon, the New Testament. It had to have universal acceptance, and it had to be written by an eyewitness or by someone who knew an eyewitness. And then thirdly, it had to hold to the Orthodox Christian faith. And that is why the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Pontius Pilate, which are Gnostic Gospels, which means they're based on Gnostic philosophy, were excluded.
So this is not accurate. Church leaders did not sit down and draft criteria for including texts in the canon and then go see what made the cut. Church leaders took the canon as it was forming based on observations about what the congregations were doing, and then they post hoc came up with what rationalizations would fit, even though there were some problems at the boundaries. For instance, texts like Revelation were actually rejected by the majority of Christians, but it was Athanasius who included it in his canon list and made a big deal out of it that resulted in Revelation moving from overwhelmingly rejected to overwhelmingly accepted.
Okay, so Dan says a lot of the canon process was post hoc, this criteria they came up with. What are your thoughts on that? And then I have a final question about essential Christian doctrines.
Both Cliff and McClellan make several mistakes in what they are saying.
Yeah.
And they say some truths as well. It is true that you didn't have Christians sitting around and saying, here's the criteria that we're going to use. But as we look at the decisions that the church made, not to determine what's in the canon, but to discover what God had inspired, that was the process. Cliff was absolutely right. There was no church council. We have no universal church council that determines what the canon is until the Council of Trent, after Protestantism had formed, and where they rejected the Protestant canon, and they added 14, 15 books that had been, some had, they part of the Greek translation of the Old Testament, but they're not part of the Hebrew Bible. And so Protestants follow an Old Testament canon that agrees with the Jews, and Catholics and Orthodox follow the Old Testament canon that agrees with the Greek literature. But that's a different matter. As far as the New Testament is concerned, Bart Ehrman actually did a great service for evangelicals by, in his book Forged, he said, if the early church considered a book not to be written by the name ascribed to it, it was out automatically. And so this fellow Cliff said, written by an eyewitness or an associate of an eyewitness. No, that's not correct. I think he should have said, and much more accurately would have said, an apostle or an associate of an apostle. And I think he just got some of his facts wrong from the literature that he was using, I'm sure. But the first criteria of canonicity, of what they recognized as canonical, would have been, is it written by an apostle or an associate of an apostle? And again, Ehrman has helped us a great deal in this, because he said if they thought it was not by somebody that the name is ascribed to, then that was automatically out. Now, one of the things that's interesting here is that this means that if a book was written in the 2nd century rather than the 1st century, automatically it's out, because the last apostle died in AD 95 or so, John the Apostle. So you have all these other books, the Gnostic Gospels, and just some crazy things that come down the pike centuries later that were never even remotely considered. Dan Brown says there were 80 Gospels floating around when at the Council of Nicaea, they determined we're only going to have 4. Well, he made all that up out of whole cloth. I mean, I don't know how many Gospels were floating around, but it sure wasn't 80. We have a number of them. Maybe there were 15, 20, something like that we know about. But there's only one of them, besides the 4, that was probably from the 1st century. That's the Gospel to the Hebrews. And maybe the Gospel of the Ebionites, but we don't have those books anymore. We just have references to them. The Gospel of Thomas, the most famous apocryphal work, was written probably between 120 and 140. There's kind of a general scholarly consensus. Some date it much earlier, some much later. But the Gospel of Thomas, it was accepted in some local churches, but it never got off the ground. Here's one of the interesting things about these Gospels. Not one of our New Testament Gospels had the attribution in it originally. Matthew didn't write his Gospel and wrote the Gospel according to Matthew, and same with the rest of them. In fact, the two most important manuscripts, perhaps, for our whole New Testament are Codex Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, both written in the 4th century, and both originally contained the whole Bible. We only have 4 manuscripts from the first millennium that had the whole Bible in them. And they have as the titles for the Gospels, according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, according to John. They don't have the Gospel according to Matthew, just the word according to. Whatever it is, it's according to Matthew. The word gospel may have been added in light of what Mark says in verse 1 of his, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, who's the Son of God. And so consequently, those titles were added later. And yet it's universal. Nobody says the Gospel of Mark is called the Gospel according to Peter. And yet the universal testimony is that Mark gets his Gospel from Peter. There was an impulse in the early church to put the name of an apostle on a work to that would get it accepted. And this is the impulse that liberal scholars say was true for these for our canonical gospels. Well, if that's the case, why don't we have anything that says the gospel according to Peter?
Mm-hmm.
We don't have any manuscripts that say that, as far as I know. And the Gospel of Mark has been thoroughly examined with the titles and all this in all the manuscripts of the first millennium, at least. So when you get into the 2nd century, now the Gospel of Thomas says the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Mary says the Gospel of Mary. Same with the Gospel of Philip and Judas and all the rest of these. Why is it that you have the names associated? It's because they're getting a late start. And if you're going to get a late start, if you want to pull the wool over people's eyes, you've got to associate it with the name of an apostle. They, if they haven't studied the history, don't know where this came from, they might say, oh, this really is authentic. Thomas, the Gospel of Thomas, is moving towards Gnosticism. It wasn't quite fully Gnostic itself, but that work was, as I said, accepted in some parts of the church, but just a couple of local churches basically accepted it. But once they recognized that a book was not by an apostle, they rejected it.
Yeah.
Ehrman says they didn't do a careful enough job. They should have rejected all the rest of these books. But he's really ignoring this universal testimony that starts from the very beginning and goes on. Let me add another thing that Cliff didn't mention and Dan McClellan didn't mention, and that is a book called Constantine's Bible. It was written several years ago by a professor at the University of Tennessee. His name escapes me right now, but one of the things he looked at, very important part of this book, he was not an evangelical scholar. What he looked at was Eusebius and his desire to create a canon list, if you will. It was like, this is his hobby, his avocation. I want to find out which books belong in the New Testament. And before the Council of Nicaea, he writes his ecclesiastical history. So that was written in no later than 324, Council of Nicaea 325. And already he has all 27 books listed as either homolegumena, which means accepted by all the churches from the very beginning on, or antilegomena, which means accepted by most of the churches, but not all of them from the beginning on. The author, Daniel, I think is his name, but I can't remember his full name. He said that Eusebius, his term homolegumena, is a technical term that means that Eusebius was able to check in the church history annals the 5 major sees, the 5 major churches of the ancient world, and from the 1st century on, get a universal testimony, a unanimous testimony from those 5 churches that these books were authentic. And so you have all of 13 of Paul's letters considered authentic. They were the homolegumena. Hebrews was considered by the Greeks as authentic. The Latins had problems with it. But as you go through this, the Gospels were considered authentic. The Gospels and Paul's letters were the very first ones to be considered as something you could read in church settings. And that would have happened no later than the 1st or 2nd decade of the 2nd century.
Interesting.
So Constantine's Bible is a major study. And this scholar was not out to prove this, but he did nevertheless, that homolegumena we have 22 of the books that fit the homolegumena and 5 that don't quite. They're still accepted by the majority, but not by all these major C's. Those books, the major books of the New Testament, are hugely significant and accepted right from the beginning as authentic. That's something that he's not mentioning.
Yeah. The author is David L. Dungan, for people who are interested in that book, Constantine's Bible. So,
thank you.
So to wrap up, and then we'll do super chats. You can take off if you need. I'll stay and do them for sure. But we want Final question you wanted to make sure we go over is, does any of this threaten essential Christian doctrines? Because this is something that was implied a lot in Dan McClellan's video.
Right. No, it does not.
Mhm.
It's interesting. Muslims, atheists, some Mormons, uninformed skeptics would say that Constantine invented, for example, the deity of Christ at the Council of Nicaea. If he did, then he must have lived a really long time, because P66, a manuscript dated between 200 and 250, has most of the Gospel of John in it. And right at John 1:1, it says, like all the other manuscripts say, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. P75, that comes a few decades later, same thing. Codex Sinaiticus, about AD 350. Codex Vaticanus, about AD 350. The ancient translations, the church fathers, they all say the same thing. When it comes to the deity of Christ, there's absolutely no dispute. When it comes to another word or two in John 1:1, there are some disputes, but not on that point. And you even have church fathers discussing this, saying he did not say this. They talk about different Greek word orders, and he said this. And basically, the word order that they are affirming is the most concise way in Greek that you can affirm the deity of Christ and yet show that he is distinct from the Father. They are the same being, but not the same person. Now, that's the deity of Christ. Same thing could be said about the virgin birth, about eternal salvation as a free gift, the atoning death of Christ, the resurrection. You could go on and on for all these essential doctrines and the vast majority of the less essential ones. The only one that I know of that, and there may be one or two others that affects something, but not orthodoxy, is Mark 9:29, that one that affects orthopraxy. I'd like it if somebody can tell me about some others, because I want to make sure I'm really informed and kept up on this. But that's the one that, prayer and fasting for exorcisms or just prayer. But when you look at this, it's interesting. The guy who ended up being the principal librarian of the British Museum, Sir Frederick Kenyon, was a paleographer extraordinaire. He lived 100 years ago. And in 1936, he published The Story of the Bible. Now, he's also the one who published 3 early papyri, P45, 46, and 47, which contain large portions of 17 of our New Testament books, very large portions. P46 is 86 leaves of an original 104. So McClellan is off when he says that the papyri are not very complete. None of them is complete. But P45, 46, 47 have a great deal of material, especially P46 and P66, 75, 72. Others are pretty close to complete on what they have. But here's what Sir Frederick Kenyon said after years and years of study. And it's a great statement. The general result of all these discoveries and all this study is to strengthen the proof of the authenticity of the scriptures and our conviction that we have in our hands in substantial integrity the veritable word of God. That is a great statement, and it's as accurate as it can be. We do not have in any translation exactly the word of God in terms of the very words, because it's translation for one thing. Even in our scholarly editions of the Greek New Testament, there may be places that we may be off. Bart Ehrman said that if he and Bruce Metzger were to sit down in a room and hammer out their differences about what the original text of the Greek New Testament said, he said it would, and they couldn't come out of the room till they defined exactly the differences. He said it'd be no more than 1 or 2 dozen places where we disagreed. So I gave a much larger number than that 1/10 of 1%, but I was being generous on the other side.
Yeah.
Since Kenyon's time, however, there have been numerous manuscript discoveries. Most of our papyri have been discovered since Kenyon's time. Is this statement out of date? Was it ever true? Even with a limited number of manuscripts available in his day? Well, let me read from a statement that's more current. 2005. This is from Bart Ehrman. in his book, Misquoting Jesus. This is the appendix to his paperback edition. Before I read the question that the editors asked, it's important to note that his book first came out as a hardback edition, and within 3 months, it had sold 100,000 copies, Misquoting Jesus. It's the first popular introduction to textual criticism that deals with these issues, as he claims, in print. And it's just been wildly successful. He was on Jon Stewart's Daily Show and Stephen Colbert and other places, and he's been interviewed by lots of people. And you read his book, which is required reading at many of our universities in religious and philosophy classes to show that Christianity is dead wrong. And it looks like he's saying, there's no way we can get back to the original, and whatever it looked like, it sure doesn't look like what it does today. So the editors are asking him a question in the paperback version. They're trying to pump up sales, so they have a paperback version come out a few months later. Here's the question they ask. This is page 252 of the paperback. I'm telling your viewers, oh, there you go. That's great.
Yep. I got a picture of it. Yep.
Excellent. If they can go to Half Price Books or someplace like that, pick up the paperback edition of Misquoting Jesus. And they ask him, why do you believe these core tenets of Christian orthodoxy to be in jeopardy based on the scribal errors you discovered in the biblical manuscripts? And his response was, essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. Now, when they read his book, that's not the impression they came away with. Editors, apparently, who are doing this, are saying, why do you disagree with your mentor, Dr. Bruce Metzger, the conservative Christian scholar? He said, I don't disagree with him. Essential Christian beliefs are not affected by these sexual variants. What? Hundreds of thousands of college kids who have come from Christian homes have rejected the faith because of reading Misquoting Jesus. There is a responsibility that he bears before the judgment seat of Christ for making this kind of a statement that has created Chicken Littles, when he really should have said something like this in the book, in the hardbound print, so that even the editors would not be misled. This is a significant point. And so I don't need to quote Kenyon. I can quote Bart Ehrman on this.
Very good point. Really, yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, and I think that's really sums up the whole video and the issues with it. So we really appreciate you coming on. I know I said 2 hours. So if you need to take off, I appreciate it. I'm going to go through all my the followers super chats. But I mean, this was very, very informative. I've learned a lot here for sure. I do appreciate a lot of what you do.
Well, Michael, really thank you for the opportunity to speak to your group. You have a great following, and I'm glad to have been privileged to have been part of this.
Yeah, absolutely. So great having you on. We hope to have you back, and I will hopefully see you at ETS in Boston in November.
Yeah, great. Yeah. Thank you.
Excellent.
We'll be there. Bye-bye.
All right. Thanks for having me on. Okay, so. All right, everybody. Thank you. I'm sorry for all the super chats that came in and that we didn't have time for Dr. Wallace to get to them, because as you can see, he doesn't really have the gift of brevity, but the knowledge he shares is definitely something I want people to hear. So I just kind of was letting him go because he gave a lot of really interesting stuff about the variants, about the embarrassment of riches, about how we know there's reliable. He said a lot of interesting stuff about the Alexandrian manuscripts that I knew somewhat, but he kind of like put it in words that made me go, oh, I have been thinking about this wrong a lot. I see what he's saying now. So very good stuff. But I'm going to go through all super chats. So if you want any more, put them in now for sure. I will answer them all. So Maxwell asks, would you offer suggested readings on Christian beliefs around gay marriage? Or are you willing to share your views? Yeah, I would say, I've said this before, gay marriage is a covenantal issue in Christianity. It's wrong for Christians to engage in. I recommend the small book, Is God Anti-Gay by Sam Alberry. That's a good book. Robert Guénon has a really good book on, it's like homosexuality in the Bible. And he's been kind of going back and forth in videos with Dan McClellan. I think his channel is called Robert Guénon. Let me just check that for you out really quickly here. So yeah, he's actually been on YouTube. Wes Huff shared one of his videos recently. But yeah, his channel is called Robert Guénon, Gagnon. You can see him replying to Dan McClellan on this very issue of gay marriage. Are there any manuscript variants in the New Testament that alter or changes any meaning of any passage verse? Oh, hi IP and Dan Wallace is based. Yeah, appreciate the super chat. This probably came in before he really answered that in detail. But if you scroll back, you see he covered this in detail. Yeah, there are early. He talked about some changes are viable and meaningful, but that's 1/10%, and they don't really affect essential Christian doctrines, as he noted. Even Bart Ehrman acknowledges. And they're just little things like Romans 5:1. Is it we have peace with God, or let us have peace with God? That kind of stuff. Any theories on how the Gospels first circulated? So there's dime a dozen. If I would ask Dan Wallace to be here for another hour. So the earliest ones is that I kind of take the view that Mark wrote first, and he was, I think Clement of Alexandria talks about this, is that so some Gentiles in Rome were urging Mark to write down what Peter was preaching, so he did, and it became a teaching gospel in that church. Same with sort of Matthew in Antioch, same kind of thing. I think it started out as a way to sort of teach the gospel to new Christians as well as to evangelize. I think they were just texts used for training up Christians, teaching Christians, as well as evangelizing. And so as they were using them, other churches that had been formed by Paul and some of the other apostles heard about churches like in Rome or Antioch having a gospel, and they wanted a copy. So they go and they get one and they make a copy and they bring it back. That kind of thing is probably going to be the best way you're going to get that kind of thing going. But again, it's all a lot of speculation for sure. Trying to build an Iron Man from the skeptics, isn't it reasonable to think that an all-powerful God would ensure the New Testament accuracy is 100%? So we would say that that's assuming a lot of it, that has a lot of assumptions in there that have not been addressed. So, for example, an all-powerful God could do that for sure, but he's also dealing with certain creatures along the way, us namely, and our needs and our issues that we have to deal with. So you have to understand that God is going to be working with people where they are in terms of that. So there's a scholar named Edward Grant who wrote a book called The Foundation of Modern Science, or The Foundations of Modern Science. And one of the things he noted is that in his book, he's talking about Christian doctrines. But what he says is certain Christian doctrines, like the Trinity, Transfiguration, were complicated. And so Christians had to read Greek philosophy, come up with new terms to help explain this, help to grow their mind and advance their knowledge. So maybe this idea we have of God spoon feeding us everything isn't right, because he's working with us in our sinful, fallible states. And sometimes he reveals certain things that makes us think, makes us wrestle with it in order to grow in knowledge and to continue on. And so I would say the New Testament, as you heard from Dr. Wallace earlier, is very, very accurate. It's incredibly accurate in terms of what we're able to show through the manuscript traditions. He's talking about the Alexandrian manuscripts, for example, the variants that we have. So it's incredibly accurate, I'd say within the 90s. And we have every reason to trust what we're getting there. I don't think we can ever say 100% just because of the nature of philosophy. But I'd say it gets really, really close to that. And so because of what we have, we're able to learn and discover how accurate the New Testament is instead of it just being completely spoon-fed to us. And we never actually grow in knowledge. We're never actually able to wrestle with these things, which I think actually does help us walk in Christianity. So is Luke 23:34 a late addition? Let me put that up here. Let me just put that up. Read that. I think parts of it, if I remember correctly, are. So that is, Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. The note here is that some manuscripts omit the sentence and Jesus and what they do. So it could have just been, Father, forgive them. So it's debatable. I don't think it necessarily was. I think, it's hard to really tell when it comes to something like that. What's Dan's dating on the Gospels, where he did address this a little bit earlier when he talked about Luke writing Acts probably around the early 60s. So he kind of follows the view I was promoting a while back, that John probably wrote last, 90s. That's kind of what I got from him as well. But the other gospels seem to have been written around the early 60s. He didn't really mention Matthew, though, to be fair. Nero died in 68. Why would Revelation code his name with a number of it that was potentially written 30 years after his death? Well, that's a good question. So some, like Kenneth Gentry, have argued that Revelation was actually written in the late 60s. So that could be the case. Some think he was supposed to be resurrected. Some think he just represented the evil that was the Roman Empire. And so there was like a coded language to refer to evil Rome. Remember that evil Nero? Yeah, he's really Rome. It could be like, we're talking about the soul of America, and we mentioned like George Washington or Abraham Lincoln, even though they're not with us anymore. Do you have your slides against Ehrman? He does not. I think he was streaming from his phone, and so he's not going to have his slides. I don't know if he still has them, though, but you could always email him and ask, is what I would say, Tina. How do you feel about the new Superman IP? I did not see it, so I do not know. I cannot speak on that. Is there proof Ehrman was a pastor or a Christian? I think his testimony is good enough. I don't think he has any reason to make that up. I don't see why we would consider him lying on that, unless we've got good reason for that. So the burden is on someone suggesting he is lying. I think his testimony is good enough evidence or something like that. What current translation would be good to use since there are all these variants? Do these variants change the gospel? So I think Dr. Wallace would recommend the NET. I still like the ESV. It's just how I was raised, so I use that. NASB is also pretty good. And the Revised Standard Version, the newer ones that have come out of those, also pretty good as well. Check those out. I do like the ISV, though, the International Standard Version. There are some things I like in there. 2 Corinthians 3:6 KJV equals 2 Corinthians 3:6 New King James Version is not the same thing as covenant. This is a major issue. I don't think it is. I think this is an exaggeration. Do you think conjectorial emendation is necessary for reconstructing the New Testament text? I'm sure Dr. Wallace could answer this for an hour. For those who don't know, this is like where you don't really have it in the manuscripts, but you're looking at a text and you're going like, well, maybe we don't have any support for this in manuscripts, but maybe this is what the author meant and there was some corruption. And so this is what they meant. So you could think like, let's say like we had a manuscript, all of our manuscripts said, after me comes heir. And, as Dr. Wallace was saying earlier, and we would say, well, that's probably not what he said. He probably meant another. The words are very similar in Greek. He probably just meant an heir. So that's the way that could work. I don't know if it's necessary for the New Testament, given the amount of textual manuscripts, textual variants we have. If it is going to be useful, it's going to be case-by-case basis for sure, Dwayne. Sorry I didn't have time to ask him this. Again, he said 2 hours. He wants to go through the video. Not as much, a lot of time for questions. I did warn him about that. But I would say it's going to depend on the variant. There might be one in Jude, I think, with that issue of who led Israel out of Egypt. Was it Jesus or the Lord? I think most scholars would lean towards the variant being Jesus. But I don't think we even need conjectorial emendation for that. I think we do have some in that, but they're later than some of our earlier ones. But I think in one of our earliest ones, it actually mentions like a wild reading, but it still refers to it being Jesus. So it really depends. I think this could be a case-by-case basis. Is that 300 ways in Koine Greek or modern? I think it's Koine is what he was talking about, Fisherman's Corner. I think that's what he was talking about. Than's been replaced by someone distinguished. That is true. So I'll conduct myself appropriately. What does Dan think about the funniest of not significant variant? I think one of his favorite ones is that one he mentioned earlier. He always brings it up when John the Baptist says, after me comes another. And in a late manuscript, it says, after me comes heir, because again, the variant is so close in the Greek. So I think that's one of his favorite ones. I'm pretty sure that's his favorite one, if you're going to ask me. Any idea on who the naked man was? It is in Mark 14. Yeah, the one who fled. So this is debatable. I remember, what's his name? John Bergsma argued it might be in a scene because he's wearing the scenes wore something similar, like just linen, which was expensive, but they just wore one garment of it. So he was arguing it could be like in a scene follower of Jesus, I think is what he was saying. Some have argued it could be Mark, because this is Mark like subtly putting himself in the text. I'm not sure. I don't think it is Mark, because I think Papias is clear that Mark didn't know, he didn't hear the Lord. So it's probably not Mark, the disciple of Peter. It probably would have to be somebody else based on that. It could have just been a disciple. It could maybe it's the beloved disciple, perhaps. Some think it might be John Mark. I've heard this as well, that John Mark would have been a young man at the time. It could have been he was sleeping. He heard the commotion, went to see what was going on, and that whole happened. It's probably just a young man who was a disciple of Jesus. May have been someone living at the house, followed them to the garden, and that's it. It's at the end of the day, it's all speculation, unfortunately. Currently a youth minister getting my master's in theology online. Good. I hope one day to teach at college. What career decision should I be looking to do, and how does someone become a professor? Sorry, I didn't get a chance to get to this question with him. I apologize. Gained off the base. Again, I knew this was going to happen. If I was going to give my opinion on this, I would say, first of all, it would be really, really good to get more people like this in the churches who are teaching theology, who are going into these deep issues for people. It'd be great to have churches have a pastor who is focusing on apologetics and ministry and theology and focusing on that for sure. I would say if you can get that opportunity, please do that. We need more of that in the churches. Otherwise, I would say maybe try to teach at a secular university as well. We need more conservative-minded folk, as Dr. Wallace was saying earlier, in the universities, and it's been hard to get them in there because of the way the American culture is designed. It's not the case in Britain. See what's going on. So that's the limited advice I can offer. As a translator, how do you keep your theological bias to a minimum while translating the Bible that multiple denominations will be reading? I think it's hard to get any bias out of anything. I think he's very good at it, though. He doesn't shy away from the difficulties. He dives headfirst into them, but he also doesn't shy away from the incredible facts that we are getting out of New Testament criticism, for sure. Thank you for the super chat. Good job at what you guys do. Appreciate that. Dan M. The text has no inherent meaning beyond what I give it, which is always right and is always is literal, unless I need it to not be, and everyone else is dogmatic. F me, where's the Tylenol? Yeah. Trust me, Dave, I know exactly what you mean. He'll say in one video, texts have no inherent meaning other than what we assign to it. In another meaning, he'll tell us what the Bible's meaning is. It's absurd double standards. In one video, he'll be like, you can't assume univocality when you, but then in another video, he'll be talking about Mark 2. As I know from experience, he was doing this a couple months ago with me. He'll say Mark 2 doesn't say Jesus is God, and then he'll jump to like John 20 to help support his reading. So I was like, well, that doesn't help your case, Dan, because in John 20, it's clear he's clearly calling Jesus God. This is what Thomas says. What was Dan's reply to me? Stop assuming univocality. Dan, you're the one that brought up John. Were you assuming univocality when you were trying to use forgiving of sins in John 20 to support your reading of Mark 2? No, it's okay when he does it, but when we do it, it's assuming univocality. It's an odd double standard. And you can see those. See the latest video I did on Dan McClellan from, I think, back in April. You can see that very case happening right there. Second question, Dan, do you agree that with the NET Bible reading of 1 Timothy 3:1, or do you agree with the notes that states that the verse could be instructions for deacons? I apologize, Sanctuary. I didn't have time to get to this question. I unfortunately cannot answer this one. I wanted him on to talk about the video. I knew we were going to get a bunch of super chats he wasn't going to get time to get to, so I apologize. We will have William Lane Craig on the channel tomorrow for anyone who's interested. He'll probably have more time to go through super chats, I hope. No, you never know with some of the older thinkers and in our experts in our area. But for those interested, William Lane Craig will be on the channel tomorrow at 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. You can see it here. Hopefully you guys can cover that. And you guys can ask him his questions there. Apologize for being off topic earlier. What is your favorite question to answer or point to make, or something you were excited to explain recently? Getting really into explaining the problems with Islam for sure. That's kind of the thing I'm interested in right now. So that's what I'm going. Explaining the Islamic dilemma is one of my favorite things to show and all the problems with it. I'm going to be doing more videos on that for sure. Pred says Grandpa balls. Okay. Thank you for your input, sir. Best book or books for understanding the Trinity. Yes. The Incarnate Christ and His Critics is very good for understanding why Jesus is divine. But anything from Dr. Joshua Sijiwati, his dissertation is good. He's got some papers on this. Look up Joshua Sijiwati on understanding the Trinity. That would be a good place to start. He's got a really good paper on that. Let me see if I can find that one really quick for you. It's a good paper. So Logical Problem of the Trinity, a New Solution, I believe is the one I'm thinking of, as well as The Love Argument for the Trinity, a Reformulation. Might be good places to start. IP, do you agree with the Man, there's so many additions of this one. Do you agree with the NRSVUE changes the word homosexual to sexually immoral in 1 Corinthians 6 and 1 Timothy? I do not. I think homosexual is going to better capture that because Paul is referring back to Leviticus 18. Robert Cannon has talked about this in his book, Homosexuality in the Bible. And those are the words. That's what he's referring back to. It's not, I get what they're trying to do. I don't think it's malicious or anything like that. Yeah, I think that's what they're trying to get back to. So I think that's going to best capture. Now what they're saying in 1 Corinthians is more going to capture the idea of like, not so much modern homosexual marriages. They're going to capture more of the idea of ancient Greco-Roman culture where you had a passive partner always and a non-passive partner. And the non-passive would have been the older adult who is doing his thing to the passive partner. And that's more or less what they're getting at. That would have been more similar to the culture of the time. If you were a passive partner, you weren't an active partner. If you were an active partner, you weren't a passive partner for sure. How spicy can our questions for William and Craig be for tomorrow? If he doesn't want to answer them, he's not going to answer them. But I can't police the super chats, tell you not what to send in. But if something's too weird, I'm not going to bring it up to him for sure, just to keep that in mind. So, all right. I'm going to close this out. Than and I will be live tomorrow with William Lane Craig on the channel. Thanks for coming. I hope everyone enjoyed what Dr. Wallace was presenting. He's a lot of really good information. And sometimes it's best just to let him go on and spill it all out for people to hear. So appreciate everybody coming. See you guys tomorrow at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You made it to the end of this video, which means this message matters to you. If you want to see more content like this reaching people for Christ, you can help make it happen. Your support makes these videos possible. Click the link below and donate today. And if you want to go even deeper, consider joining our Patreon community. You'll get early access to videos, behind-the-scenes content, and a place to connect with others passionate about this mission.